Good morning. You might take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 2. That'll be the first verse we look at, and we'll spend some bit of time in those early chapters of Genesis. Appreciate the opportunity to stand before you this morning, and sorry that so many are out, but perhaps there are some who are able to take advantage of the Facebook live stream and receive some encouragement, and hopefully they will be back with us very soon, but glad you're here. I want you to think about, as you've watched the news over the last, several weeks and maybe even a couple of years, at the push in our country for things that we would find, maybe hard to wrap our minds around. The push for abortion in recent weeks. Obviously, abortion has been the standard. It's been allowed with very few restrictions for decades now, but with the potential that laws might be changing, how vitriolic and intense the opposition to that has gotten. Some people in our country are demanding abortion be available up until the very point of birth, some even at birth or even just after birth, so that in a baby in a womb or even coming out of the womb that could survive because it's a few inches up a birth canal or because a certain amount of time has not passed, could be killed, could be murdered. And there are, I think, a larger segment than we would like to admit who are not just saying that that should be all right, but should be championed and even celebrated. The push for homosexuality has been going on for decades, but within the last decade or so, 2008, the Democratic candidate for president said that he believed marriage should be between one man and one woman. And that's 2008. That's in my living memory. And yet within the last few years, the push for acceptance and the embrace and celebration of homosexuality and other forms of sexual engagement. You may have noticed that we're in the middle of Pride Month. It's hard not to notice. And in all of this, individuals who don't celebrate or applaud people's sexual choices are labeled as bigots and religious extremists. There was a case lately in Major League Baseball. The Tampa Bay Rays were going to wear a rainbow-colored patch on their jersey. And there were a few players who offered the most milquetoast opposition. I mean, they said, we're not condemning anybody. We're not saying it's a sin. We're just saying, as followers of Jesus, we don't think that's something we should be celebrating. And numerous sports commentators said that they were using their religion as a cover for bigotry, exclusion, and hatred. So in what universe is it that when I don't celebrate somebody else's choices, now all of a sudden I'm a bigot, I'm a hater, I'm an exclusionary person? Well, in this universe, evidently. And in connection with that, we have the even more recent push for the celebration of transgenderism. And in all of these things, I want to be careful. And here I want to walk an especially fine line. I think many of the people who are labeled as transgender have issues and concerns that should be compassionately and carefully addressed. Psychological problems, gender dysphoria, I think is a real thing that ought to be very carefully treated. The problem is that we have a society. The craziness is that there are people who, because a very small segment of the population has psychological and physiological distress, that now they have decided that you cannot define what a man or woman is. And that if you do define what a man or woman is, using the standard that people used for thousands of years up until about 5 minutes ago, now you're a bigot. And the problem is that we live in a culture where, you're not allowed to say these are boy things and these are girl things. But then if a boy shows an inclination for flowers, he must be experiencing some kind of gender disassociation. And if there's a girl who likes to climb trees, when supposedly these things are not supposed to be boy things or girl things in the first place. And I think the problem is that we have not so many people with this dysphoria, but so many parents and school teachers and other influential people who are pushing this kind of thing. Now, I think that many of us would find the intensity and the anger and the extremism in these positions to be jarring. I find them to be jarring. We may not be able to believe that we're living in the same reality as people who champion these things. Now, this lesson is not intended to be political, although I recognize there's a political element to all of this, and it would be almost impossible for me not to say something about this and somebody have suspicions about political inclinations. But what I want to do this morning is think about the attitude that I think is underneath all of this. Because while we may think the world has gone crazy, and in one sense it certainly has, there's an underlying challenge in this and other cultural degenerations. And namely, the key challenge behind all of this is who will be God? Who will be God? You see, the push for abortion, homosexuality, and transgenderism is not just a difference of opinion. It is an absolute challenge to the authority of God to define what is good and right and true. It is a challenge to God's place as the supreme ruler of the universe. It is an attempt to subvert and undermine any dependence on God to determine what is normative or acceptable. There is a real sense in which we are not living in the same reality as the people who push for these things so intensely. They are beginning with a very different vision of the world. They are fighting with everything they've got against the vision of the world the Bible proclaims. So when you bring up, well, I don't support this thing, or I don't want to celebrate this thing, you are not simply, in their view, challenging this one thing. You are challenging their whole perspective and their whole right to determine good and wrong as they would have it. They're attacking your whole way of thinking about the world around you. When you say they are not right in any one of these areas, you are challenging their right to be the authority of what is right and wrong, good and bad, to be the God of their own life, to determine their own direction, and that can't be tolerated. And so that's why you have the vitriol and the hatred and the attack when you just say, well, I can't celebrate that, or I don't think that's right. You're not allowed to believe that way, because then you're challenging the God. And in this case, the God is themselves and their own lusts and their own bellies. To be sure, this was the attitude behind the very first sin. God had established a boundary. He had defined what was good, and He defined what was off limits. I've had you turn to Genesis chapter 2. You're probably familiar with this from Bible class. But in Genesis 2, verse 9, out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Notice who defines what good for food is. God does. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So you have God making provision and providing what is good and establishing what is good for people. And in verse 16, the Lord commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. And so God not only establishes what is good, He establishes what is wrong. He sets a boundary, and He gives the consequences of violating that boundary, of traversing that. And then notice where Satan attacks over in chapter 3. The first thing that Satan says is, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? And I think the sense of that is can you believe that God would set a boundary over something like that? Can you believe that God would limit what you would be able to do? And the question is asked in a way as to doubt the provision and the blessing that God had given. All right, there was no lack in the garden. There was no failure for God to provide what was good in the garden. There was one restriction. And Satan says, I can't believe that. I can't believe that God would restrict you. And the woman, recognizing that God has made a statement about this, says, no, God says we can eat of the other trees of the garden, but we cannot eat of this one, and we cannot touch it. And Satan says, you will not surely die. So now he's gone from incredulity, right? I can't believe God would say that, to outright lying and denying what God has said. You will not surely die. Now he's doubting God's word. But he goes further than that. And in verse 6 he says, God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. He goes further from doubting God's word to now doubting God's goodness. And what he's saying is that there is something in this that you need, that would be good for you, that's actually better for you than what God has provided for you. And God, by drawing a boundary like that, is trying to keep you from what would really make you happy and fulfilled and what would be best for you. And that's every temptation. Every temptation wants us to underestimate, undervalue the provision that God has made for us. Every temptation wants us to deny the consequences of what God has said will happen when we don't listen to Him. And every temptation causes us, asks us to doubt whether or not God actually has our best interest at heart. Because if God actually cared about us, wouldn't He let us do this thing that we really want to do? That's what Satan wants us to believe. Now notice the woman in verse 6. It says that when she saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desired to make one wise. I want you to see that. When she saw that it was good for food. Who said so? Who said it was good for food? Not God. Right? God had made provision with every tree in the garden that was good for food and had drawn a boundary around this one that was for the knowledge of good and evil. And so God has said this one's not good for food. Now, who's going to be in the position to determine that? Who gets to decide that? The fundamental temptation here is who gets to sit on the throne? Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? Who gets to be God? Who will be God? The woman defines for herself what was good, decided that God's boundaries were overly restrictive, decided that this would give real wisdom rather than listening to God's wisdom. This would allow them to be really like God, even though they were already image bearers of the Creator, and traverse the boundary that God had established. And so, while we might see it apparently in what's being pushed for in our culture, don't miss that at the heart of sin is that very same idea of who will be God. Now, in our current society, think about the boundaries that are being crossed and traversed and really eliminated. Life, sex, gender. When those things are broken, when those boundaries are broken, what boundaries remain? These things are central to the identity and mission that God has given humanity. They are foundational. They are so foundational that they are rooted in Genesis 1 and 2. And the challenge to them must necessarily tear away at the truth revealed there. For example, abortion, by demanding the right to kill a child. The abortionists are rejecting, denying, and in some cases, absolutely decrying the idea, the truth that all people are made in God's image. Now here's the thing. Most of the time when we're talking about abortion, we're talking about very difficult situations. Often. Sometimes when we're talking about difficult situations. But I'll tell you, the circumstances under which a child was conceived don't make a child in the image of God or not. The difficulties with which your child may be born with don't make a child in the image of God or not. Right? Little babies inside the womb are in the image of God. Old people are in the image of God. Black people and white people are in the image of God. Children with Down syndrome are in the image of God. Children conceived in the worst possible socioeconomic circumstances are in the image of God. And it is a usurping of authority for us to step in that place and say, we have the right to determine whether or not this child lives or dies. And in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female who created them. You have never met a person. You have never met a little baby. You have never met any child, any person who is not an image bearer of the Creator. And in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, it is on that basis that God levies heavy consequences on the person who would undervalue that. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in His own image. And I said in most of the cases we're dealing with difficult circumstances. You can look at the statistics of why women say they're having an abortion, and the vast majority of them is some kind of economic inconvenience. And a huge number of them are not in low socioeconomic statuses. They're in relatively middle class or comfortable situations. Now I realize that there are all sorts of reasons why somebody would go and do that. But that somebody would say that we have the right to do this is what I'm challenging. Homosexuality is denying that God's design for man and woman is the only legitimate expression. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, Moses says, "Therefore the man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." That is the normative standard statement for what is the proper sexual expression. That's it. And so when we think about whether or not polygamy would be okay, the argument for that is coming. Whether we think that bestiality would be okay, that argument is coming. And so the slippery slope remains the undefeated champion, right? 10 years ago, somebody said, "Oh, nobody will ever make the argument for those things." It's already happening, right? And not only that, but also happening that your children ought to be subjugated into celebrating these things. So, again, people say, "Well, that's a slippery slope argument." Well, so far, it is playing itself out. But here's the point I want to make, is that anything that violates the one man and one woman for life principle is a violation of the standard that God gave. And so why is it so important that we tear that down? Well, because we want to be God. In fact, in the book of Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul makes the very point that at the end of the road of a society that has rejected God and that has traded the creature for the Creator, that is worshiping the thing that's made rather than the thing that made it, is this kind of sexual perversion. Over in chapter 1 of Romans and verse 21, "For though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." And so what does Paul say here? He says God gave them up. God gave them up to use their bodies in ways that He never created them to be used, to violate the creation order. Now, Paul makes the point that homosexuality is more than preference, it's more than lifestyle, it's more than identity. It's at the end of a long road that starts with rejecting God as the authority. And transgenderism denies that in male and female, in His image, He created them as a definitive statement of reality. Now, this challenge is not new. I know I'm emphasizing the things in our culture that point to the fact that people are challenging this idea, but it's not new. We've already seen it in Genesis, but it's also the attitude that was at work in idolatry and in the idolatry of the nations. So Mr. Timmy read for us from Psalm 135 that people would make idols of silver and gold, idols that can't talk, they can't hear, they can't smell, they can't do anything. But notice how they're described in Psalm 135 and verse 15. He calls them the work of men's hands. They're described that way in Psalm 115 and verse 4, the work of men's hands. Isaiah 37 and verse 19, the work of men's hands. I'm just emphasizing that is the way in which they are described in the prophets. But over in Isaiah 40, and I do want to take just a moment to look at this passage. Isaiah 40 and verse 18. What would possibly be the motivation for the foolishness of what Isaiah describes in Isaiah 40? Isaiah 40 and verse 19. An idol, a craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts it for silver chains. He who is too impoverished for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move. Think about what's happening here. They're going and they're finding silver or gold. They're going and finding wood, and hopefully we find wood that doesn't rot. And then we take that wood, and we have a craftsman, and hopefully he can build this idol well enough that it won't totter or wobble or fall over. And then what do? This idol that we're worrying about falling down, we fall down in front of it, and we worship that. And in other places, Isaiah talks about the foolishness of taking some wood, and a third of it you take and you make a fire, warm yourself, and a third of it you cook your food over, and a third of it you worship and say, this God that brought me forth. How silly. How foolish. Now, what would motivate something like that? Well, I think it goes right to what Brother Timmy read for us in Psalm 135 and verse 16. They have mouths, but do not speak. In Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 19, he says that the idols can offer no guidance. I think that's it. What would motivate someone to make an image of a God who did not exist in exchange for worshiping the true God? The idol doesn't speak. And so, if I want to go my own way and be my own person, I get to put words in the idol's mouth. I get to define the expectations. I get to be God. Because the true God has some things to say about the way I'm living. And He won't accept otherwise. But here's where I hope the lesson hopefully gets personal. Every sin is a challenge to God's authority. Every temptation is a challenge for us to answer the question, who will be God? You know, when the New Testament talks about violating the principle of being made in the image of God, you think it talks about murder? In one of the places that connects the idea that we're made in the image of God, James chapter 3 and verse 9, I want you to listen. With our tongue, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not so to be. Do you know when the New Testament talks about violating the principle of the image of God, it's talking about using our tongue in a way that would bring cursing to our brethren? When we use our tongue at other times to bless God. So when we slander and use foul language and lie to and gossip about our brethren, we are saying we get to be God. I get to determine when the likeness of the image of God matters. I get to determine who is valuable and who is worth my kind speech. And we're violating the very principle that people who would take human life are violating. When the New Testament talks about violating the fundamental marriage principle, you know, when Jesus says, go back to the beginning, it's in Matthew chapter 19, and there are people who have come to Jesus, and they say, do we get to divorce our wife for any cause? And Jesus says, from the beginning, He made them male and female, and concludes, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. In that context, Jesus is not addressing the sin of homosexuality. He's not addressing polygamy. He's not addressing some other sexual perversion. What He's addressing are people who think that they can marry and divorce for any cause. And Jesus says, you are violating what God has intended from the beginning. So at the same time that we look at our culture and we say, there is an authority problem here, we need to look at maybe a little closer to home. Notice what Paul says at the end of Romans 1. Is the result of a society that rejects God's authority. I want you to look at this. I've not made this connection as clearly in my mind before, I don't think. In Romans chapter 1, he goes through this long description of the unnatural relations that human beings have because they have rejected God and they've rejected His order for society. And look at what he says in verse 28. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Well, what's he talking about here? Verse 29. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness. You ever struggle with covetousness? Would it be possible to live in the most materialistic society in the history of the planet and not to be at least tempted with a problem of covetousness? Malice, they are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, and not only those who do them, but who give approval to those who practice them. Notice what Paul is saying here. It's not just homosexuality that's at the end of the road of a society that has rejected God. It's celebrating gossip. It's celebrating covetousness. It's accepting and supporting deceit. And things start to hit closer to home, don't they? When I have the choice to lie and save my skin rather than tell the truth, the question is who gets to be God? Will I allow God's authority to reign, or will I determine what's good? Will I determine what boundaries are allowed to be crossed and which ones aren't? When I prioritize work and family above the Lord, the question is who gets to be God? Does my own self-interest or does the Lord's will? When I reject His pattern for the home for my own happiness. When I choose my own way of worship. When I seek vengeance rather than forgiveness. When I consider myself before the brethren. When I use words that tear down rather than words that build up. When I'm envious and coveting and stealing rather than being content and willing to share. When I'm gossiping so that I can be the center of attention. And the list goes on and on and on and on. It's in those moments where I am deciding that I get to be God. Any thought, word, or action that does not acknowledge and submit to God's rule is a challenge to God's authority in my life. Of course, sure. Look at our society and say this is a world gone mad. It's a world gone crazy. Our world has, in action and in explicit statement, rejected God's authority. They have gone so far in rejecting that it does seem sometimes like we're living in different realities. But let's not forget how we get to a place like that. It starts by rejecting God's authority in what we might think are much more minor ways. It starts by ordering our lives around comfort, or money, or family, or self, or pleasure. And then it won't take very long before nothing seems too extreme in the pursuit of our idol. And things begin to spiral out of control. So what's the solution? Our goal is to bring every thought, every word, every action under the lordship of Jesus Christ. The thing that makes us different is not that we have not struggled with the question of who will be God. The thing that makes us different, that ought to make us different, is that when we were buried with Christ, we said, He is Lord. And in all the places where we continue to struggle with who will be the authority in my life, we are over and over and over forced to recognize our own failure and say, but I'm submitting to Christ. I'm submitting that to the Lord. The answer to our societal woes is not, at its heart, political reform. The answer is for folks to give up authority over their will and way and give it to the true King. We want to take every thought captive for Christ. And I'm not sure what the future holds for our country. And when a nation has rejected God, destruction can't be far behind. But if we will give our allegiance to Christ, we will live and we will flourish. Maybe not here, but for certain in a place where only righteousness dwells. And that's the hope for the person who says, who will be God? Christ is God. And I will let Him reign over my life. If you're like me, a lesson like this begins and say, well, maybe I'm immune from some of this. And then the target gets closer and closer and strikes right to the heart. And I see all the ways in which, unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say it, daily, I have to struggle with this question of who gets to make the choice here, who gets to make the decision here. But a Christian is someone who has renounced everything else and has said, when the question is asked, when the decision has to be made, I have already decided for Christ's sake. And if you need to make that decision this morning, Christ's invitation is open. And if you see all the places where you have failed to make the right decision, and you need help in getting back into a place where you are submitting to the authority of Christ, we want to help you in that. And if we can be an encouragement to you, if we can be an aid to you, we want to. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.